Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. A few issues we want to talk about here today. MAID, all right, medical assistance in dying. Interesting issues that have come up over the last little while we need to touch base on. Free speech or the lack thereof. Where are we headed on the issue of abortion? So a number of things to tackle before we do. A quick reminder to hit subscribe. Tell your friends about us as well. And our guest today, joining us from Ontario, is Jonathon Van Maren, host of the Bridgehead podcast. He's a newspaper columnist and an activist, communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. And he's also the author of a book that I found very, very helpful. It's called How We Got Here, a guide to our anti-Christian culture. And it tells you how we got here. It's a really interesting look at history, and we can learn from that. His website, thebridgehead.ca. Good to have you with us, Jonathan.
Always good to be with you.
You bet, it is. Lots to chat about today. I know you were down in the U.S. For the March for Life, so I want to ask you about that too. But why don't we start off with MAID, first of all. The Ontario MAID Death Review Committee report highlighted a couple of interesting cases. One is the case of an elderly woman who was allegedly euthanized against her will within hours of her husband claiming that she changed her mind after first insisting that she in fact wanted to live. And he said he was experiencing caregiver burnout. So there's a whole bunch of concerning things in this particular case. Any thoughts on this one?
I think this is one of the many cases we've seen over the last several years that emphasizes how legalizing euthanasia suddenly blurs the lines around murder. Because in the case you just referenced, which got reported in the international press, starting with the Daily Mail, talked about a case where a woman who was at home recovering from a surgery, things kind of took a turn for the worse, and her family says that she wanted euthanasia. But when they called a MAID assessor, as they're called, to check up on her, she said that she didn't actually want euthanasia, that her religious convictions forbade that, and that instead she wanted inpatient hospice care. The family requested that, and it was denied. And the next day, even though doctors had declared her to be physically stable, they put in an urgent request for another medical aid in dying assessment, as it's called. That second assessor said she was eligible, called the first assessor, as is protocol in Canada. The first assessor said absolutely not, totally disagreed that she was eligible, and requested that he be able to come and visit her the following day so that he could reassess her. That was refused by the euthanasia provider on the basis that the case was urgent. A second assessor was called in to essentially sign off on the euthanasia, and she was killed that evening. And so everything about this case is horrifying, but this is just one data point in many data points that shows we don't even know how to identify a cold-blooded murder when it's staring us in the face at this point.
Yeah. There's been some interesting online comments for some high-ranking people saying this was murder. And I guess when you look at it, you go, well, they're family, they love each other, they just did it out of compassion. But, again, if I take a gun and shoot, my relative because I think they'd be better off dead, that's murder. You're just not using a gun.
Well, there's three different ways to look at this. The first is that they requested inpatient hospice care and it wasn't available. So this really wasn't the choice that euthanasia advocates talk about because they weren't given the life-affirming alternative. The second is that coercion is a real problem in many of these cases, which is why the first MAID assessor who signs off on people for euthanasia totally disagreed that this woman was in fact eligible under Canadian law. The third problem is a problem that keeps on resurfacing, which is when somebody ends up getting killed and they get killed under circumstances that, as the Death Panel Review Committee called, questionable deaths, how do we know anymore what counts, especially because the victim in question has been killed by lethal injection? So there was a case in December in British Columbia where a man was openly talking about his death plan for his wife. He was planning to euthanize her and then kill himself. And she was suffering from Alzheimer's and thus ineligible for euthanasia, but people had heard him make these plans for a long time, right up to the funeral arrangements. And so a judge intervened to remove his guardianship and basically said this is not the way euthanasia should be conducted. But there was a UBC law professor who pointed out he was planning to murder his wife And even in the judge's ruling protecting her, he acted as if this was not murder so much as an inappropriate execution of MAID protocols. That is what has happened to Canada as the result of legalizing euthanasia.
There's so many questions around this, right? So if your very first assessor says, no, it shouldn't be happening, then you just take it to somebody else who's going to say yes, and there's no... is there not some sort of protocol when you have disagreements there from medical professionals that this should no way ever happen in a few hours, that the person is dead now through MAID? Should this not go through some sort of a court legality process to make sure no one's being euthanized against their will?
Well, it should, but again, like the review committee called this, one of several questionable deaths. Well, what is a questionable death in the context of somebody getting a lethal injection? But what you have too is desperate people who are not eligible for euthanasia, who are shopping around until they can find a practitioner willing to do it and MAID assessors willing to sign off on it. And probably the most notorious euthanasia executioner in Canada is Dr. Ellen Wiebe of Vancouver, who did the first euthanasias in that area out of her abortion clinic. She performs both abortions and is now responsible for over 400 deaths by euthanasia. And she's been involved in a number of very high-profile cases. She's had complaints brought against her by families. She's had a complaint brought against her by a Jewish nursing home after she snuck onto the property, even though it's not allowed on that property.
Wow.
And euthanized a terminally ill Jewish person in his home, traumatizing Holocaust survivors who were in the same home. And she was found not guilty of any wrongdoing. And so attempts by family members to get justice and attempts by other people to bring these cases to the attention of authorities don't seem to actually create any criminal consequences for those that are doing these things.
So we've got lots of stuff coming down the pipe here then, because in 2027, right, we have to have a decision coming down here by the federal government. They haven't indicated clearly which way they're going to go on this, and that is, should we allow MAID solely based on someone's mental health or not? In Canada, I think if you ask the general public, there seems to be, some discomfort with that, right? Hold on a second here. That seems a little loosey-goosey. So have you heard anything, coming down on which direction they're leaning at this point?
Well, we know that the Canadian public is uncomfortable with this because that's the reason the Liberal government has delayed implementation of this twice. And it's now been delayed till 2027. There's a bill in front of Parliament right now, put forward by MP Tamara Jansen and seconded by MP Andrew Lawton, Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act, which would ban euthanasia for mental illness. Thus far, the comments from Liberals in the House of Commons during debate in December seem to indicate that they just want to let this go till 2027. And if they're going to cancel it, they'll cancel it on the basis of a report on the preparedness of the healthcare community. At the same time, I know that Carney and the Liberals are pretty unhappy about the fact that last year in April, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities explicitly condemned Canada's euthanasia regime and specifically called for them not to expand euthanasia to those with mental illness. So it doesn't look like the Liberals are willing to vote for Bill C-218, although we could be pleasantly surprised. I hope we are. But we'll see what happens when we get closer to 2027. The reality is that if the Liberals don't stop it, or if just a handful of them don't defect and get Bill C-218 through, then we're going to be in a nightmare scenario where the kinds of horror stories we just discussed become incredibly routine.
Yeah, that's a real call on Canada when you see the UN of all people, telling you you're going too far. Yikes. Yeah. Okay. Now, you just came from that March for Life in Washington, D.C. Tell us, what was the turnout like? What was the focus?
So the slogan of the march this year was "Life is a Gift." There was over 100,000 people there. It's always very impressive to be in D.C. for the March for Life because it's the largest annual anti-abortion demonstration in the world. You see that there's still a lot of politicians who come out and address the crowd, right? Senate Majority Leader John Thune sent a video. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who's a very committed pro-lifer, was there. Vice President J.D. Vance spoke. But there was also a real divide in the pro-life movement this year because the Trump administration has been either overtly reluctant or claims it can't do anything about some really key issues. There's some very simple things they could do to bring the abortion rate down because abortions are surging now because of the abortion pill. And the reason that's the case is because state laws in places like Texas or Florida or Iowa can't take effect when abortionists are mailing people pills from states like New York and California. And in the first Trump administration, and this was sort of standard practice, to get abortion pills, you need an in-person appointment with a doctor. But Biden removed that on the pretext of COVID. And so now essentially state laws don't matter. So Donald Trump is kind of saying, well, I helped you overturn Roe v. Wade, and now this is up to the states. But the states can't enforce their laws until that rule is put back into place to stop the sort of vast network of abortion pills being shipped across borders. And so the divide between the pro-life movement and the administration was pretty stark in Washington last week.
Well, I'll bet. Now, how simple would that be? How could that be done? Does it have to go through the Supreme Court again, or can Trump do this with an executive order?
Oh, to restore that rule, it's a stroke of a pen. Like if they wanted to do it, they could do it. It's a very simple move.
Okay.
It is absolutely true that most of the policy that needs to be implemented to protect children in the womb is on the state level. But again, you can have states with the best pro-life protections, and those protections mean nothing if you can simply order pills from an abortionist or a dispensary in a blue state.
Wow. So this needs to be a prayer priority at this point as well for Christian viewers. That needs to change. I mean, there's so many lives lost with that. Where are we at in Canada with abortion pills?
Well, so Canada's data is incomplete. So it's always difficult to tell exactly how many abortions are happening annually. Both abortion activists and the government seem to indicate the abortion rate is going down, and the latest numbers do include the abortion pill. So we know the numbers are higher than are being reported. They're reporting it at around 85,000, but there's lots of clinics that aren't required to report their data. Much of Quebec doesn't report their data. So there still does seem to be a sort of with as much information as we can garner, I would say the trend lines are in the right direction. If right direction is something that you can say when you still see almost 100,000 children in the womb being killed brutally every year. Yeah,
that's some perspective for sure. Leading cause of death worldwide. That is, you just got to shake your head, say, how is that possible? That should not be there, anywhere close to that. Now, Trump has also been doing a bit of waffling as well on the Hyde Amendment, right? So this is the prohibition of federal taxpayer money, right, going to fund abortions, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the Hyde Amendment, named for the Congressman Henry Hyde, who initially drafted it, was passed in 1976, and it bans any federal dollars being used to pay for abortions. And it saved, by the estimates of the Charlotte Losay Institute, or almost like 2.6 million lives since being implemented. But Donald Trump is facing a tough midterm battle. Obviously, some of his policies have been very unpopular, and he's sort of a very bombastic fellow, and he's been doing all kinds of things in his first year and a half. So they're really worried about losing the midterms. And so he really wants to get some sort of health plan through as something to run on later this year in the midterms. And so he told the congressional GOP that they should become, quote, flexible on the Hyde Amendment, do what it takes essentially to get it through. If you gut the legislation of the Hyde Amendment, this is one of the last remaining pro-life protections. And so that you've actually put your finger on another thing that was a source of massive disappointment in Washington. I actually attended an event put on by Mike Pence at the Advancing American Freedom think tank just prior to the march. He brought it up. SBA Pro-Life America's executive director, Marjorie Dannenfelser, who's probably one of the most powerful political lobbyists, pro-life political lobbyists in Washington, brought it up. Hyde is very much at the front, at the front of everyone's mind right now. So we'll see what happens. J.D. Vance came out and he had, he's a great speaker. He has genuine eloquence, and if he writes his own speeches, his word crafting is very, very good. But there's a big gap between the rhetoric expressed by Trump administration officials at the march and what they're actually willing to do, and in fact, what they're willing to work against the movement on. So it's an ongoing fight right now. Yeah. The fact that fight is now in public does tell you something about how bad things have gotten, but we'll have to see where it goes from here.
Okay. You mentioned Mike Pence. He's such an interesting character. I really like him. He's very, very strongly pro-life. Any thoughts on, because apparently he was very active in this in this particular March for Life, and he always has been. Any chance of him, rising up again in the future? What are you hearing politically? He didn't do terribly well last year, or in the nomination, battle there, I guess, in the States. I mean, I think a lot of people would love to see him get involved politically again, but I don't know. Too little, too late. What do you think?
Well, the Republican Party now is very dominated by Trump. And of course, Trump has a very specific narrative about what happened in the 2020 election. And there's a lot of, I wouldn't call them conservatives, but MAGA figures who will never forgive Mike Pence for doing what I think was both the right, honorable, and courageous thing. And so Mike Pence is doing what I think is really important to do, which is he's institution building. Advancing American Freedom is a think tank that's they got just great people working for them, and they're focused on producing excellent policy to inform Republican legislators. So he's having a real effect that way. He's been a congressman, he's been governor of Indiana, he's been vice president. I think he's put in his time, and now he's working on building an institution that can project his values, and I would say my values as well, into the future.
All right. Well, maybe you could do more good that way. Who knows? And getting in politically, but all right. One other guy I want to mention here. You talk about him on your blog here. Again, if you're just tuning in, thebridgehead.ca. You talk about Gavin Newsom, California governor, very likely, going to run in 2028, I assume. And you say, especially on the transgender issue, which kind of is one of those issues that sunk the Democrats in the last go-round. He's a bellwether person to watch on this issue.
So I think he's a bellwether because Gavin Newsom is one of the most talented politicians I've ever seen, which is terrifying because he's an awful person and he holds values that are opposite to mine in almost every way. But when you watch him as a political operator, he's incredibly smooth. He's very eloquent. He's very good at finding a common ground with people who would disagree with him on virtually everything and taking kind of the sharp edges off very leftist policies. And so after the 2024 election, when Trump's ad in particular, the Kamala Harris is for they, them, and I'm for you ad, which was devastatingly effective, you're watching the Democrats trying to pull away from the transgender movement, the transgender cause, but it's difficult for them to do so because they essentially accused the Republicans of being guilty of an LGBT genocide, calling sex changes for children a human right. Once you've staked that position, you can't really pull away from that position without looking like you are now, willing to stand by while, people are being killed and things like that. And so they're kind of victims of their own extremist rhetoric right now. And so it's been interesting to watch Gavin Newsom try to search for a middle, winnable, politically palatable ground on this issue. He said in an interview with Charlie Kirk just 6 months before Kirk was murdered, that he agreed that it was very unfair for biological males to be allowed to participate in female sports. And then he got a huge backlash from LGBT activists on that issue. And then suddenly the governor of California was in court with the Trump administration over that precise issue. Ben Shapiro does an interview with him, and he won't say, what a man is and what a woman is. And so it's watching Gavin Newsom, who's very smooth, very intelligent, a very adept political operator, struggle to answer basic questions on the transgender issue is a real indication of the fact that the Democrats haven't figured out how to disentangle themselves from a movement that kind of has them in a death grip at the moment.
I long for the days when we had politicians who had convictions and stuck by them, whether or not you agreed with them. Rather than waiting to see which way the political winds are blowing, and then I'll change my convictions, whatever it takes to get your vote. I hate that. And I think a lot of our viewers hate that as well. Man. So here in Canada, where are we at, I guess, when it comes to some of these issues like the transgender, winds blowing this way or that way? Carney is, of course, traditionally been, pro all of these kind of LGBTQ things, and I imagine that's probably not changing, right?
Now, Carney's not going to change on any of these issues. One of his children identifies as a transgender activist. When I say children, she's a public writer in her 20s, and so she engages in activism like this as an adult. But interestingly, the only one who's shown any real courage on this issue is Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta. I say interesting because Danielle Smith is not a social conservative, right, and in fact left the Wild Rose Party in part because she disagreed with the sort of heavy dose of social conservatism that was sort of shot through that party. And yet she is the one who has put forward the most courageous legislation, kind of combating LGBT extremism, both in schools, but also banning sex changes for minors. And when she put that legislation forward, the reason I was so encouraged is because A, she's not a social conservative. So B, it means that she knew she had internal polling that showed that this was a rock solid popular thing to do. When somebody who isn't a social conservative is willing to be courageous on an issue that encourages social conservatives, you know that they really know this is a winning issue because they're willing to stake on it. And she has, right? Notwithstanding clause.
Yeah.
And so Danielle Smith is kind of a model for conservative premiers across the country, but there's no other takers thus far. Blaine Higgs, obviously, as premier, was phenomenal. He was the one who kind of started the pushback against the radical indoctrination in schools, socially transitioning kids without their parents' knowledge. But Scott Moe hasn't really done much in Saskatchewan. Doug Ford is not conservative by any definition that is recognizable to conservatives. So right now, it's only Alberta where you're seeing anything happen on that issue.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll see if we have time to touch on Alberta separation or not. But let me ask you about Bill C-9, free speech, freedom of religion. Bill C-9, it's been placed on pause, at least for now, at committee level here. They want to focus more on, more urgent political issues such as, bail reform and so forth. But it will come back. So the issue that concerns, I think, many Christians is, of course, the removal of the religious exemption clause. So potentially this could criminalize someone reading from Leviticus or wherever, something that's, anti-LGBTQ or whatever the case might be. And someone says, hey, that's illegal. And again, potential criminal charges.
Yeah, so this was put forward, by the Carney government in a deal with Quebec, because Quebec, of course, is aggressively secular. And it was just paused for 2 weeks after a very sustained pushback campaign by conservative MPs who did town halls across the country. For My Canada hosted a grassroots campaign for 12 days, resulting in 40,000 phone calls being made to members of parliament. So what's interesting is the Liberals have a strategy of putting things on pause and letting things cool down and then coming back to them. So the fact that they paused this for a couple of weeks means that the message has been heard loud and clear, and all of your listeners and viewers should be encouraged to keep on pushing, or if you haven't joined that campaign, please do. Go to formycanada.com, get involved. But it means we need to keep up the pressure. It means they delayed it for 2 weeks. They're kind of hoping it will die down. Everybody will go home and then they can smuggle it back in. But there's encouragement there to keep on pushing, I think.
Yes. And I'm sure Faith Teen will get right back on that and others, and that's our job, is to participate in that, pray, but also act, in this case by phoning your member of parliament, right? So hold their feet to the fire for sure. Very, very important. Now, if you look back at 2025, any particularly were there any losses you think that were significant for truth and freedom? Were there any victories to celebrate? I mean, I do like the appeals court ruling. Well, I guess that was 2026 here, I think, right? The appeals court ruling here that the Emergencies Act was in fact illegal. I was really happy to see that, although that could still go to the Supreme Court of Canada. But any thoughts looking back here?
Well, obviously, I think one of the most significant losses that a lot of young Christians in particular felt personally was the assassination of Charlie Kirk on September 10th. It's become clear, I think, since his assassination that assassinations work. There really wasn't a figure to replace him. He was sort of one of a kind. And so that's obviously sort of a devastating loss that is felt very keenly at the moment and will, I think, be felt even more keenly in the years to come. There were, I think, really good things that happened as well. I'll just cite there's lots of things I could get into, but I think I'll just cite my favorite one, which is the government in Slovenia, their left-wing government legalized euthanasia. And the only way that you can sort of unring that bell and roll that back is first by getting enough signatures to trigger a public referendum, and then by winning that referendum. And so first they managed to gather enough signatures in a very short amount of time to trigger a public referendum on the issue. And then even though they were losing 60-40, by the end of the referendum, they had pulled significantly ahead, over 60%. They won the referendum and repealed euthanasia in Slovenia, which is just...
That is mind-boggling. It's just mind-boggling. How did they do that when it was 60-40 the other way? Like, how did that happen?
Anybody who's interested can go to my Substack, the Bridgehead. I actually did an interview with the man who headed up that campaign, and he explained their entire strategy for doing it. But it really was, he calls it a miracle, but nonetheless, there are some specifics as to how this miracle was performed.
I do wonder, if that was God's hand on there that ultimately tipped the scales. But of course, God works through regular human beings like you and me. So, we got lots to pray about here in Canada. Man, I got a long list of things I want to go through here, but I don't think I'm going to have time. Politically speaking, we've had some floor crossings, which I despise, right? So, where are we going here, I guess, Carney close to a majority. And again, so how does that impact morality here in Canada? So what should the Conservatives do? Should they shift their policies? Any thoughts where we're heading here, I guess, in the moral climate of Canada?
Well, nowhere good at the moment because we're facing yet another year of liberal rule, and the Liberals are firmly on the side of the sexual revolution. They will continue to expand that in any way that they can, and the difficulty is that the Conservatives provide more of an echo than a choice in many ways because their pitch is just sort of axe the tax, build the home, stop the crime. But what they're more or less advertising is, the more of the same, pride parades, but with a better accountant than the other guys. And so the reality is that if Mark Carney turns out to be good at, building the homes and axing the tax, which he did right away, and stopping the crime, then plenty of Canadians can be forgiven for thinking there's not much of a moral distinction between the two parties. And so at the moment, there are individual Conservative MPs who are very worthy of support and that I'm very proud to support myself. And I would advise everybody to vote for. But they're, as a party, you're kind of voting for them because they're not as bad as the other guys, not because they're offering a real moral alternative. And that's too bad because we're one of those Western countries that doesn't have a good alternative.
Yeah, I hear you. I got to leave it there for time, but Jonathon, thank you so much for sharing your views on this. Really important stuff. I encourage people to check out your website, thebridgehead.ca. It'll make you think. This is a call to prayer and action from the grassroots up, I think, to save our nation. I'm out of time here. Hit subscribe, tell your friends, WizeUp.ca.